The cross-species security integration work was the kind of problem that rewarded the patient attention. He had understood this in the first week of the Verath 3 posting and had been developing the patient attention's application for 4 months. The specific application of the attention to the daily proximity of the different operational traditions, the attention that was building the understanding of what each tradition was actually doing rather than what the documentation said it was doing. The documentation said each tradition's methods. The daily proximity said each tradition's assumptions. The distinction was the work. He was in the 4th month's 2nd week, running the morning security integration assessment at the facility's central training ground when she arrived. He had been aware of her for 3 weeks, the awareness that the facility's proximity produced in the security functions practitioner, the specific quality of attention that noted the significant presences in the operational environment. Sorvin Thale had the quality of a significant presence in the way that certain people had the quality of the significant presence, not the obvious quality of the loud or the dominant, the specific quality of someone whose capacity was deep and whose attention was the full kind, the kind that was taking in the full picture at all times. She was the Keth Warrior Corps Senior Integration Officer. He knew the Keth documentation. The bilateral relationships development had required the thorough documentation of the Keth military tradition, the tradition that the Joint Authorities Assessment had described as the most technically sophisticated of the frontier zone species military traditions and the most formally structured in the specific forms it required. The documentation was thorough and accurate as far as it went and insufficient in the specific way that all documentation of the living tradition was insufficient. It described the forms and not the assumptions behind the forms. He had been observing the assumptions for 3 weeks. She came to the central training ground with the quality of someone who had made a decision and who was in the decision's execution. The facility's morning assessment personnel were present, the 14 security integration specialists of the current training cohort, the mix of species that the bilateral relationships development had brought to the frontier training facility. They read her arrival with the collective quality of people who were in the operational environment and who were noting the significant thing entering the operational environment. She came to the center of the training ground. She looked at him. He said, Senior Integration Officer Thale. She said, Specialist Duvel. She said it in the register of the formal address that preceded the formal challenge, the register he had read about in the documentation and which he recognized in the direct experience of the form. She said, I challenge the human security specialist to the Keth assessment duel. The training ground had the quality of the held breath, the specific quality of the facility's personnel in the presence of the significant moment. He said, yes. He said it in the register of the direct acceptance, the form the documentation described, and which was, in the direct experience of the form, the only register the situation was asking for. She said, the traditional form, 3 rounds. The facility's central training ground. The morning of the 3rd day from this one. He said, yes. She said, the witnesses are the facility's personnel. He said, yes. She said, the draw is the outcome the tradition recognizes as the most significant. He said, yes. I know. She looked at him. The look had the quality of the assessment, the first assessment, the assessment that preceded the duel's assessment, the reading of the person who had said yes in the register of the direct acceptance without the hesitation that the differential's acknowledgement would have produced in a person who was calculating the cost. He was not calculating the cost. He was noting the first assessment and noting what the first assessment was noting. She said, the 3rd day's morning. He said, yes. She moved back through the training ground with the quality of someone who had completed the function's first phase. The training ground's held breath quality released into the specific ambient of 14 security integration specialists in the presence of what they had just witnessed. He went back to the morning assessment. He went back to it with the quality of someone who had been in the significant moment, and who was in the significant moment's aftermath, and who was, in the aftermath, in the 3 days that preceded the morning of the 3rd day. He thought about the Keth assessment duel's documented form. 3 rounds, first round, the physical contest. Duration of the round, until one participant yields or the round's time limit is reached. The Keth tradition's physical capacity. The documentation's description. He had the specific numbers, the specific differential, the specific quality of the gap between the Keth warrior's physical parameters and his own. He knew the first round's result before the first round began. He thought the first round's information. He thought the investment and the cost. He thought, yes. Second round, the tactical assessment. The joint authorities' documentation had a specific notation for the second round. The notation that the non-Keth participants performed significantly better in the second round, because the tactical assessment rewarded the operational thinking over the physical capacity. Third round, the endurance trial. The sustained engagement under the accumulating physical pressure. The accumulating pressures management as the key variable. He thought about the accumulating pressures management. He thought about 4 months of the cross-species security integration work. The specific function of managing the accumulating pressure of the different operational traditions in the same environment. The daily management of the friction that the proximity of the different assumptions produced. He thought the endurance trial's specific mechanism. He thought, yes. The next 2 days were the work of the 4 months continuation, the security integration assessment, the documentation, the daily function. He did the work with the quality of someone who was doing the work, and who was also, in the doing, in the preparation that was not the explicit preparation, but the preparation of the full quality of the attention directed at the work's content. He observed Sorvin Thale. He observed her in the way he had been observing her for 3 weeks, and which the challenge's acceptance had clarified into the specific observation that the duel's preparation required. The observation was not the strategic analysis of the opponent. It was the patient observation of the specific thing she was doing in the daily function. The observation that the cross-species security integration work had taught him was the most reliable instrument for the understanding of another person's operational approach. The specific quality of her movement, the specific quality of her attention in the different contexts, the specific patterns of the Keth tradition in the live expression rather than the documentation's description, the assumptions behind the forms. He was ready on the 3rd day's morning. The facility's central training ground on the 3rd day's morning had the quality of the significant event, the facility's personnel in the witness positions, the specific ambient of the gathered attention that the Keth assessment duel's traditional form required. He stood at the training ground center. She stood across from him. The distance between them was the distance the Keth tradition specified for the duel's beginning, the specific distance that the documentation had noted as the distance from which the first round's engagement began. He looked at her. She looked at him. The facility's senior officer, a thorough Varath colonel whose function included the formal oversight of the interspecies traditional engagements within the facility's protocols, said, "The Keth assessment duel between Senior Integration Officer Sorvin Thale and Specialist Iran Duvel. 3 rounds, traditional form." He said yes. She said yes. The first round began. He had 2 specific decisions before the first round began. The first decision was the decision about the first round's purpose. The documentation had described the first round's standard approach for the non-Keth participant. The maximum engagement, the attempt to exceed the differential through the specific techniques the cross-training provided. The result that was typically the yield or the time limit's conclusion in the Keth warrior's favor. He had made a different decision. The first round's purpose was the observation. He was in the first round for the information. The specific observation of her engagement style in the first round's physical contest. The patterns that the Keth tradition produced in the live engagement rather than the training context. The specific rhythms and the specific commitments that the documentation had described, and which the documentation's description was insufficient to fully characterize. The second decision was the decision about the yield. He had decided not to yield, not because he expected to change the first round's result. The differential was what it was, and the result was going to be the result. He had decided not to yield because the yield would have ended the round, and the round was the information, and the information required the round's duration. The round's time limit was 4 minutes. He competed in the first round for 4 minutes with the quality of someone who was in the full engagement, and who was, in the full engagement, conducting the observation that the full engagement produced. He observed. The Keth tradition's physical engagement had the specific quality of the committed movement. The movements that the Keth warrior made were the movements of someone who was fully in the movement, without the reservation that the exploratory movement produced. The commitment was the tradition's quality, the Keth warrior committed to the movement, and the movement was the full expression of the intention. The commitment produced the specific rhythm. The rhythm had the specific predictability of the committed pattern, not the predictability of the poor practitioner. The predictability of the excellent practitioner whose excellence was in the commitment's quality, and whose commitment produced the pattern that the commitment's consistency created. He noted the rhythm. He noted the specific moments in the rhythm where the commitment's full expression created the brief interval, the interval between the commitment's completion and the next commitment's beginning. He noted 3 specific intervals in 4 minutes. The round concluded at the time limit. She had the first round. He had the 3 intervals. The facility's personnel had the first round's result, the result that most of them had expected, and which the expected result's quality of confirmation produced in the witness positions. He was breathing with the specific quality of someone who had been in the sustained physical engagement, and who was managing the engagement's physical cost, with the management that the endurance trial's later requirement made the priority. She looked at him from across the training ground. The look had the quality of the assessment, not the first assessment's quality, the assessment of someone who was in the duel's progression and who was reading the progression's first data. He said nothing. She said nothing. The second round began. The Keth tactical assessment round was the round the documentation had noted as the round where the non-Keth participants' performance improved significantly. He had read this notation and had understood what it described, and was now in the understanding's application. The tactical assessment round's form was the form of the engagement with the tactical elements, the training ground's specific features, the positions, the use of the environment, the decisions about the engagement's development that the participants made in the round's progression. The tactical assessment was the round where the observation was the instrument. He used the first round's observation, the 3 specific intervals, the rhythm. He did not wait for the intervals to arrive in the rhythm's natural progression. He created the conditions that moved the rhythm toward the intervals. The tactical assessment's form allowed the specific positioning and the specific engagement approaches that the physical contest's form did not permit in the same way. He used the form's specific allowances to produce the conditions. The first interval arrived at the round's 90-second mark. He used it. The second interval arrived at the round's 2-minute and 40-second mark. He used it. The second round concluded. He had the second round. The facility's personnel had the second round's result, the result that most of them had not expected, and which the unexpected result's quality produced in the witness positions. The specific quality of people who were in the presence of something they had not anticipated, and who were in the unanticipated thing's presence with the full quality of their attention. She looked at him from across the training ground. The assessment in the look was the fuller assessment now, the assessment of someone who was reading the full picture that the 2 rounds had produced, and who was, in the reading, in the presence of something the reading had not anticipated. He was managing the physical cost of the 2 rounds with the management that the 3rd round's requirement made the priority. The 3rd round began. The endurance trial. The documentation had described the endurance trial's form, the sustained engagement under the accumulating physical pressure, the pressure that both participants were in simultaneously, the round that continued until one participant yielded or the round's time limit was reached. The time limit was 12 minutes. The accumulating physical pressure was the physical reality of the Keth warrior's physical capacity applied over 12 minutes of the sustained engagement, the accumulating cost that the 12 minutes produced. He had been managing accumulating pressure for 4 months. Not the physical accumulating pressure specifically, the accumulating pressure of the cross-species security integration work, the daily management of the friction that the proximity of the different assumptions produced, the sustained function in the environment where the pressure was the operational baseline. The management's mechanism was the same. The management's mechanism was the specific quality of the not yielding to the pressure while not fighting the pressure, the management that the frontier station's isolation had first taught him, and which the cross-species security integration work had developed into the specific competency of the person who could be in the accumulating pressure for the sustained duration, without the pressure becoming the object of the function rather than the context of the function. He was in the endurance trial with that management. At the 4-minute mark he was managing. At the 7-minute mark he was managing. At the 10-minute mark she was reading him with the quality of someone who was encountering the unexpected in the endurance trial. The quality of someone who had conducted the endurance trial 3 years of challenges, and who was, at the 10-minute mark of this endurance trial, in the presence of something the 3 years had not previously produced. He was at the 10-minute mark's management with the quality of someone who was in the significant effort, and who was in the significant effort with the full available capacity. The 11th minute, the 12th minute. The round concluded at the time limit. Neither participant had yielded. The draw. The facility's personnel had the draw's result. The result that the documentation had noted as the result the Keth tradition recognized as the most significant. The result that neither the victory nor the defeat produced, but which the equal engagement produced. The witness positions had the draw with the quality of people who were in the presence of the significant thing. He was standing at the center of the training ground with the quality of someone who had been in the full engagement's 3 rounds and who was in the full engagement's conclusion. She was standing across from him with the quality of someone who was in the same conclusion and who was also in something else. The something else of the assessment's full result. The assessment that the 3 rounds had produced and which the draw had concluded. She crossed the training ground center distance. She said, "The draw." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." The post-duel conversation was the participants' conversation. The facility's personnel had moved to the morning's continuation, the assessment's conclusion, the training functions returned to the daily operation, the facility's ambient of the ordinary work. The Keth tradition required the post-duel conversation to be the participants' conversation, and the participants were in the conversation in the training ground's edge, the specific space that the tradition designated as the post-duel's appropriate location. She said, "You knew the first round's result before the first round began." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you competed in the first round anyway." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "The first round's information was the investment. The first round's result was the cost of the investment." She said, "You spent the round as the information-gathering mechanism." He said, "Yes." The first round's physical contest was the observation platform. I needed the specific observation of your engagement, the patterns the Keth tradition produces in the live engagement, the specific rhythms, the intervals. The tactical assessment round required that observation. He said, "I wasn't competing in the first round for the first round's result." She said, "You were competing for the second round's result." He said, "And the third round's?" "Yes." She said, "The draw?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You calculated the draw." He said, "I assessed the draw as the achievable outcome given the differential. I want to be accurate about this. The draw wasn't certain." The third round's endurance trial was the round where the uncertainty was highest. She said, "Why the uncertainty?" He said, "The endurance trial's physical cost across 12 minutes was the round where the differential's accumulation was the most significant. The second round's tactical approach could manage the differential through the observation's application. The third round's endurance trial required a different management." She said, "And you surprised me in the third round." He said, "Yes." She said, "How?" "I want the specific account," he said. The endurance trial's specific mechanism is the accumulating pressures management. The round's result depends on which participant yields to the accumulating pressure. The pressures management is the key variable. He said, "I've been managing the accumulating pressure in the cross-species security integration work for 4 months. The function's daily operation is the sustained management of the friction that the different traditions' proximity produces. The pressure is the operational baseline," she said, "and the endurance trial's pressure," he said, "was the same management in the different context. The physical pressure and the operational pressure are different in their nature. The management's mechanism is the same." She said, "The not yielding to the pressure while not fighting the pressure." He said, "Yes, that's the specific description." She said, "Yes." She said it with the quality of someone who had been in the thing the description was describing and who was receiving the description of the thing they had been in. She said, "The first round, the intervals." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've conducted the assessment duel 14 times in 3 years. No one has used the first round as the observation platform," he said. The first round's physical result was going to be the first round's physical result regardless of the approach. The observation was the achievable outcome. I competed for the achievable outcome. She said, "The achievable outcome." He said, "Yes." The differential analysis before the first round, the documentation's specific numbers, the 4 months of direct observation, produced the probability assessment for each round's possible outcomes. The draw was the achievable outcome that the probability assessment produced as the best available result. She said, "You conducted the probability assessment before the first round." He said, "Yes. 2 days of it," she said. "And the documentation's specific numbers." He said, "Yes. The bilateral relationships documentation on the Keth warrior's physical parameters. The numbers are accurate." She said, "Yes. They are accurate." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you what the 3 rounds revealed." He said, yes, she said. The first round revealed the decision to spend the round as the investment. The decision that the round's information was worth the round's cost. He said, yes, she said. The second round revealed the observation's application. The intervals, I know the intervals. I know the rhythm's specific quality. I have known it for 3 years, and in 14 challenges, no one has identified the intervals in the first round's duration and applied them in the second round's tactical assessment. He said, yes, she said. The third round revealed the management. He said, yes, she said, the accumulating pressures management, the not yielding to the pressure while not fighting the pressure. The specific quality that the 12 minutes produced in someone who has been in the sustained management of the accumulating pressure for 4 months of the cross-species integration function. He said, yes, she said. The draw is the result that the 3 rounds produced. He said, yes, she said, and the Keth tradition's recognition of the draw as the most significant result. He said, yes. The documentation described this. The draw is the result that neither the victory nor the defeat produces, but which the equal engagement produces. She said, the equal engagement. He said, yes, she said. I want to tell you what the equal engagement means in the Keth tradition. He said, yes, she said. The Keth tradition's assessment duel is the assessment of character under pressure. The 3 rounds are 3 different pressures. The physical pressure, the tactical pressure, the endurance pressure. The character's response to each pressure is the assessment's data. He said, yes, she said. The victory is the data of the superior character. The defeat is the data of the insufficient character. The draw is the data of the equal character. He said, the equal character. She said, yes. The character that the equal engagement reveals, the character that meets the 3 pressures with the 3 responses that produce the draw, is the character that the Keth tradition recognizes as the equal character. He said, not the same character, the equal character. She said, yes. The distinction is the important one. The same character would produce the same responses to the 3 pressures. The equal character produces the different responses to the 3 pressures, and the different responses produce the draw. The equal engagement. He said, yes, he said. The Keth tradition recognizes the equal character as the partnership's foundation. She said, yes. The documentation described this also. He said, yes. She said, and you know the tradition's declaration. He said, yes. The documentation described the declaration's form, she said. The declaration is the commitment to the shared function, the partnership in the future operations. He said, yes. She said, the draw requires the declaration. He said, yes. She said, I want to make the declaration in the full form, not the abbreviated form that the documentation may have described. He said, yes. She made the declaration. The declaration was in the Keth language, the formal register of the Keth warrior tradition, the specific language of the tradition's significant moments. She spoke it with the quality of someone who was in the tradition's full form and who was giving the full form to the moment that the full form required. Then she said it in the common language. She said, the assessment revealed the character. The character's response to the physical pressure was the investment's decision, the decision to spend the round for the information rather than the result. The character's response to the tactical pressure was the observation's application, the intervals identified and used. The character's response to the endurance pressure was the management, the not yielding to the pressure while not fighting the pressure. The 3 responses produced the draw. The draw produced the equal engagement. The equal engagement is the partnership's foundation. The Keth tradition declares the partnership in the future operations. The allegiance is the commitment to the shared function. He received the declaration with the quality of someone who was in the significant moment and who was in it with the full quality of his attention. He said, I received the declaration and the partnership. He said it in the register the tradition required, the register of the direct acceptance. She said, yes. The weeks following the duel had the specific quality of the thing that had been established and which was now in the establishment's development. The partnership's development was the development of the shared function. The specific work of 2 people who had been in the assessment duel's equal engagement and who were now in the operational context together, which was the cross-species security integration work and the frontier training facility's daily function. He found the development interesting. The partnership had the quality of the thing that the assessment duel had built the foundation for, and which the foundation was now supporting. The specific quality of 2 people in the shared function who had the assessment's data from the beginning and who were using the data in the function's daily operation. She was in the function with the quality he had observed for 4 months. The committed quality, the full engagement's quality, the Keth tradition's assumption that the function was worth the full engagement. He was in the function with the quality she had assessed in the 3 rounds, the patient observation, the adjustment to what the observation produced, the management of the accumulating pressure. The 2 qualities in the same function produced the specific quality of the partnership. In the second week's 3rd day, she said, the first round, he said, yes, she said, I've been thinking about the first round's decision. He said, yes, she said. The decision to spend the round as the investment, the information's value against the round's cost. He said, yes, she said, no one has done that in 14 challenges. He said, yes. She said, why not? He said. The first round's result is the expected result. The expected results avoidance is the first round approach's typical purpose. The people who compete in the assessment duel's first round are competing to avoid the expected result. She said. And you weren't? He said. I was competing for the achievable outcome. The first round's expected result was going to be the expected result regardless of my approach to the first round. The avoidance attempt would have cost the same cost and produced the same result and provided no information. She said, the avoidance attempt's cost and the information gathering's cost were the same cost. He said, yes. The differential between the costs was 0. The differential between the outcomes was the 3 intervals. She said, the 3 intervals changed the second round's result. He said, yes, she said. And the second round's result changed the third round's conditions. He said, yes. The draw was the achievable outcome before the duel, and the achievable outcome required the second round's result. The second round's result required the first round's information. The first round's information required the decision to spend the first round as the investment. She said, the sequence. He said, yes. The draw was the sequence's conclusion, she said. You planned the sequence before the first round began. He said, the sequence was the assessed achievable outcome. The individual round's execution was in the moment's adjustment. The intervals arrived when the observation produced them, not on the plan's schedule. She said the plan was the direction. The execution was the adjustment. He said, yes. She said, yes. She said, the human security specialist's specific competency. He said.